In this demo, I'll describe the basics of how to navigate NRDR interactive reports. So I'm going to use the standardized dose index report for this demo. And when I click on the menu item, it opens up into its own page. And we have a standard layout that we use for these reports with some icons and menu items across the top, and then some standard buttons along the bottom. Starting in this upper left corner, we have a couple of ways of getting some more information. One is a short list of tips specific to the tab that you're looking at, how to get data, if there are interactive features, how to use those. Next is a link to the knowledge base article with a lot more in-depth description of what the report is, how to interpret it, etc. And then various filters that you can use to define the criteria and refine that criteria for the data that you want to see. A standard approach is to use corporate account, and this list will be populated with only the accounts to which you have access. This test account has one, so you can select one or more values and then click the apply button. The next one is facility, and it would be listed with all applicable values. It's currently blank because there's actually no data that meet the criteria for this corporate account. And that's because this date filter is set to the current month and there are no records for the current month. This is called a relative date filter, so you can define any period relative to today. So we could go back and say show data for the current year. And now we're looking at the 1st of January 2019 through the end of December. We could go back to look at data for the past 3 years, 4 years, etc. Another way to work with dates is to set specific start and end dates. You can type a value directly if you'd like, and hit return, or you can pick a day using the calendar directly, or use the sliders to go back and forth and set the time period that way. The rest of these filters, for the most part, work in the same fashion as this corporate account filter. One exception is this query by, which is actually more like a switch. These are not data values from the database, but they're different ways to look at what we see in the report. Currently, it's set to RPID, and that affects these fields labeled RPID study description. So this filter is populated with RPIDs. This table, the first column, is listing RPIDs, and the bar chart as well. If we switch this over to study description, now those three items have all changed and they're populated with study description values. So this is a handy way of switching a report to look at things multiple different ways without having to go to a different tab or a different report entirely. So many filters are context specific. That is, the values that they're populated with depend on the other criteria. So facility is only going to list the facilities for a specific corporate account. Here the RPIDs are the only ones available for the time period. So if we change that time period, say to the past 2 years, the list of values here is going to be different. So that's just something to keep in mind. A particularly handy feature for filters with lots of values is that you can search. There's a search bar right here. It's not clearly labeled unless you pause over it. And sometimes, depending on the report, it may be up here. Other times it may be down around these cancel apply buttons. And let's say we wanted to use this search function and we want to just look at RPIDs with the word pelvis in them. The way we could do that is to first deselect all the values, and we click on all, and then enter the criteria. It's not case sensitive. And then we can select each of these items that we want to see and click apply. So now it's a handy way of doing that rather than having to go through and search visually. Sometimes you may get surprising results because of the values that are selected in a filter. And a good thing to look for is whether or not that value is enclosed in parentheses. So here we're looking at RPID 196. It's got exams from the 22nd of August 2016 through the 27th of September. If we were to change our criteria and say, look at data for the past 3 years, the report is now empty because there's no data that meets that criteria, and you can see that this value that we had previously selected is in parentheses, and that's because it's actually not applicable. 196 is not a valid value for this time period, but it's been selected, so that's why we see nothing currently, because there's no data for that time period. So we can go back and we'll set this to the past 4 years. So if you're running into some trouble, look to see if a value is in parentheses. So the values that you set here define the criteria for the report you're looking at, and in many cases, if a report has multiple tabs, that same criteria will apply across those tabs, and that's a way of saving you some data entry time. So here we've got 36 exams for RPID 196 in the exam search. And when we go over to the scatter plot, we can see those same 36 exams in the scatter plot. We could click on the box plot by scanner and see those same 36 exams in that particular report without having to make menu selections over and over again. The last kind of filter we'll look at is called a user filter, because you can define which particular dimensions of the table or graph are to be used and what values to select by. So for example, in this table, when you click on a cell, we'll click on age 83 here, you'll see two options pop up. We could either keep all the rows where the age is equal to 83, or we could exclude all the rows where the age is equal to 83. So that's a very flexible way to pick your own criteria for a report. And you can do it on multiple columns. You could even do it on these values in the table itself and keep only rows that meet that particular criterion of 21.9. The tricky thing can be if you've done one or more of these user-defined filters, you may forget exactly that they've been applied because there's no filter up here to tell you, oh, you've selected only rows with age equal to 83, for example. One way that you can undo that if you feel like you've gotten stuck or gotten a bit confused is you can use the undo button down here in the bottom left corner, and that'll go back to the previous set of filter values that you had. So here we're back to showing both rows of patients of age 83. Click on undo a second time, and we've gotten rid of the user filter for the age column. So this works just like a browser back button, but it's specific to the report. In fact, this is the only button you should use to go back. Your browser button won't work because the report was open in a fresh page. You don't want to use the forward button either. It could create unpredictable results. The redo button just goes in the opposite direction if you want to reapply a previous value. And then we have revert, which is a way of going back to the initial stage of the report, the initial settings, as if you'd open it up for the first time. So setting all the filters to their default values. These next two buttons have no practical purpose for the reports. There's no harm in clicking on them. They just won't do anything for you. And then on the far right, there's a download button. There are different ways that you can capture the report that you're looking at. You can take an image like a JPEG that you would for photos. We can download data into a comma delimited file and read that into Excel. And we have a separate demo video for that. You can create a PDF copy or even a PowerPoint. And then the last button is to put the report in full screen mode. Doesn't really have any practical value for the reports we've built because by default, every time you open up an interactive report, it opens into its own browser tab. And that's a basic overview of how to navigate through an interactive report in the NRDR portal.